All right, beautiful. So Linda writes, yes, it's a tremendous gift. So thank you, Linda. Linda's agreeing that this faith crisis can be a huge gift. That's why we named the podcast that way. Also, let's see. Linda writes, I relate to what John just said about his faith journey. Looking back over my own life, there were signs of a shift in my faith long before I awoke to the history. It's amazing to reflect on it now. There were so many times I simply refused to see what was happening until I was ready to truly hear the truth. That's really interesting, Linda. And what I want to do is just go through a lot of these comments being written and talk about each one. And I'm feeling the desire to say to Linda, it's okay that it took time.
Mm-hmm.
Like religion, I'm a believer, and some of our listeners may not like this or agree with it. I'm a believer that religion is a fundamentally positive influence in people's lives, or we would have evolved away from it. And the Catholic Church wouldn't exist. If there's ever a testament to the fact that religion must do good in people's lives, it's that the Catholic Church still exists after decades of systemic pedophilia scandals. Religion must thrive in spite of all the awareness and problems, because it's meeting people's social and spiritual and familial and identity and existential needs. And so because it becomes such a big part of our lives, it's probably not something that we should rush to jettison. And so for many of us, we can think about years and years and years where we had reason to doubt or question, but we hung on. What if that's you knowing what's best for you and what your needs are? And in your own situation at the time, Linda, it took many years because it was still meeting some fundamental core needs for you, familially, socially, spiritually, practically, health-wise, whatever it is. I just wonder sometimes if it takes long, because it should take long for many people. And it's not something that should be rushed into or thrown away lightly. Now, how do either of you feel? That might be a controversial statement. What do you guys think? Natasha or Margi?
I'm clearly going to say it's different for everyone.
Okay. We can say that.
The way they choose to navigate, or because we know people who have done it really, really quickly, and it's been great for them to do that. And on a level, they rearranged their lives, and so I think honor yourself in your process, go internal with it. And I love that quote you say about how, remind me, it's the level of comfort versus discomfort. And when it tips to, you primarily have a lot of agitation and a high level of discomfort with activity versus, then that's kind of when people make the change, is when the balances are tipped. And so oftentimes that's a very organic, part of the process.
I tend to think it's very mathematical, that if I could do one research project in my life academically, I would create a formula for all the different variables that impact religious faithfulness: family, social, financial, spiritual, mental and physical health, temporal needs, longevity in the church, your parents, your grandparents, social pressures, family pressures, awareness and knowledge about the church and its history and its problems, whether or not you've experienced, ecclesiastical abuse, whether or not you're one of the discriminated minorities or have a lot of privilege. Plug all these into a formula. I do think it could be reduced ultimately to something very mathematical, which is joy outweighs pain and suffering and discomfort. Stay a member, stay active. You will likely stay active. Once pain, discomfort, problems outweigh what it gives you, it becomes a very rational decision where you leave it because it's causing you more pain and damage than good. Do you want to jump in, Natasha?
Let's throw it to Natasha.
Yeah, I think that the more common experience is that people take a long time because of all these issues. At the same time, to Margi's point, there are people that, within a week or 3 weeks have made very stark decisions and, leave and But I think that's less common, because I think even though the personal process is long, sometimes the familial process is long. So even though maybe people have checked out intellectually or as a believer, they don't want to rock the boat too much. They're still maybe attending church to benefit, other people in their system, et cetera. So it is kind of complex, but I don't think it's controversial to say that religious systems are of use to the human population. And like I said earlier, there is a lot of research to support that religious communities can be very helpful, especially when you feel like you fit in and you feel like it's a space that you thrive in, So it does offer a lot of community, a lot of structure, there's lots of reasons. And at the same time, like most systems, there's potential for harm and for abuse, and that's because humans are involved. There's always going to be that potential. So I don't think that's a controversial statement, John. I would agree with that. I think it's helpful. And somebody even mentioned in one of the comments that Christine says that's a good thought to have for believing family members as well, to avoid judging. So for us to remember that spaces have different meanings and constructs for people.
I love it. Okay, so we've identified some domains: family, social, intellectual, educational, existential, and behavioral, and there's others. What we're now doing is we're trying to look at deconversion from those lenses and the ways that those different domains impact deconversion. So I'm just going to read through some of these narratives that our live listeners have written, and let's just respond to them. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. And highlight which domains, and maybe they're domains we haven't talked about. We'll highlight some of these domains as we read through these narratives. So, and we can take turns reading. I'll read Weston. Weston writes, I agree that you need fertile ground emotionally to even be open to a critical analysis of your belief system. This mirrors my experience. By the way, thanks for bringing up Fowler's stages. That is very interesting as it relates to Mormon Faith Crises. I'd love to hear more. Well, Weston, in my early first year of Mormon Stories podcast, I did an interview with Dan Witherspoon and Tom Kimball on the stages of faith. James Fowler was a famous psychologist in, I don't know, let's just say the mid 20th century. I could have my era wrong. But he basically followed a lot of the developmental psychologists who tried to look at life as being a process of advancing through various stages. And so while other psychologists were studying other aspects of living, he noticed that the belief paradigm started out as sort of an infant stage, which we can call stage 1, kind of this childlike phase, which we can call stage 2. And then you often settle as a religious believer into the stage 3, which is, I'll just call it Mormon orthodoxy or fundamentalism, where you literally believe the Bible is written by the finger of God, that the Book of Mormon is historical, that the Mormon prophet speaks to God literally, that the church is perfect, and you obey perfectly, blah, blah, blah. Stage 4 becomes having what they call the dark night of the soul, which is where your faith crisis happens. You let all your beliefs fall to the ground. You start to doubt and question everything, and you start to look at every little piece of your faith. It's a very natural thing that transcends Mormonism. It's very common. Let's just call it maturing faith. It happens, and then if you continue, you can emerge on the other side with a stage 5-like faith, which would be taking scriptures as myth, taking religious stories as symbolic truth, not as literal truth, looking at the world as a multicolor spectrum instead of as black and white, instead of just black and white, stages of gray or multicolor, viewing your church as good and bad, not necessarily in terms of a binary true-false model, but just as in good, but also problematic, and engaging in the church not because it's going to get you to heaven or because it's God's one true church, but it's because it's your tribe or it's your culture or because it provides value and structure, and and making your religion your own, becoming a proud buffet or cafeteria Catholic or Mormon, and engaging religion on your own terms instead of on very fundamentalist Orthodox terms. And then I think there's the stage 6, which is like Gandhi or Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr., where I think you end up getting killed because you're so awesome.
Oh, no.
I don't know. I don't know that any of us are going to aspire to stage 6.
It's not very enticing.
But but if any of you want to know more, just Google Mormon stories, stages of faith. And I think we did an early episode with Dan and Tom, and then we came back and interviewed Dan and Tom much later. By that point, Tom had left the church, but Dan had stayed in the church. And those are really classic Mormon stories episodes. And I think you can find lots of other discussions of Valor Stages of Faith on the internet, but it's worth checking out. So Weston, thanks for mentioning it. PJ, Margie, why don't you read PJ's comment here? And then Natasha, if you can see, we're just going through these comments. We'll just rotate and we'll have you read the next one.
So yes, like losing community, friends, that for me has been hard.
Okay, so PJ's talking about one of the hard parts about a faith crisis is losing community and friends. And absolutely, that's one of the most devastating.
I'm not exactly sure where you're at, but Allie Payne says, for me, it was the church doesn't want people like me. So to me, that's a social construct, right? So if that means that either she was on the orientation spectrum that's not just plain heterosexual, or maybe she's a feminist, or
a Democrat, for heaven's sake.
A Democrat, whatever
or
she
a divorced person, a
right.
single person, right?
Didn't feel like she fit the norm and therefore wasn't really validated in her life experience. So that's a social construct.
Absolutely. And that's very, very common. People just feel like they don't fit anymore. All right, Tamara. I'll read Tamara's. Tamara writes, I felt punished by the doctrine when I divorced my husband after I spent 3 years trying to make a mixed orientation marriage work and coming to terms with the fact that the gospel couldn't make my ex-husband straight. I felt my eternal family yanked out from me. Natasha, you've counseled a lot of mixed orientation marriage couples, as I have. What do you see as that sometimes being a trigger for deconversion?
Well, it's so much a part, I think, of both familial and social aspects. It's just so ingrained in like the whole expectation of how life is supposed to go, and definitely identity issues. Oftentimes the gay or lesbian member or bisexual member is feeling like, they've been promised by the church that if they marry heterosexually or do the right things, that this problem will go away. So it's one of these things where just the religious, narrative has had some very uninformed perspectives that then really creates this life trajectory for everybody involved. The LGBTQ person, the spouse, the children born into these marriages, and it's just really, really devastating on both a familial and social level. And I would even say going into the existential, because they're waiting for these kind of miracles to happen, where these issues will just go away due to obedience, and that doesn't end up being the case.
Yeah, it is so good the church has moved away from at least explicitly encouraging mixed orientation marriages. They still indirectly encourage it when they put, Ty Mansfield on the cover of LDS Living magazine, or, support these North Star conferences where general authorities go and they bring up mixed orientation marriage couples to promote, or at least to advocate for the possibility of mixed orientation marriage. But when, the mixed orientation marriage debacle that happened for decades and is still happening to some degree can be so devastating. It can, it makes you lose your faith in your priesthood leadership for promising you something that doesn't come true. It makes you question your own inspiration with God when you feel like God told you to get married to this person, and then it doesn't work out. It's devastating for your children. It's devastating for your own self-confidence as a husband or a wife that either isn't able to love their partner or doesn't feel loved or appreciated by their partner. It wrecks families. It causes divorce. It's just so much carnage. It causes problems in so many ways. So thanks for sharing. Do you want to read Courtney's, Margie? Shout out to Courtney. She's our first ever inaugural donor to the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. So we have to always give Courtney a special shout out.
Absolutely.
Hey,
So Courtney writes, I will always remember the day I went down the rabbit hole, but really the process happened for years as I tried to make myself feel good about things I didn't feel good about. Policies, teachings, practices, letting go of those things that continually hurt my soul while keeping the teachings that edify me, like love, family, has been such a gift. I love that. I love that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I just love, I think that is, kind of what we're talking about. It's that mixture of coming to yourself, having your own process, and then on some level working at healing.
And that reminds me of your narrative, Natasha. Courtney's does, because how long do we go ignoring our own conscience and our own intrinsic sense for what is right and wrong, and for what is good for us and what's good for those around us? I think that can be one of the pernicious things about, let's just say, religious fundamentalism, not religion, but religious fundamentalism, is if we're brought up in the wrong religious perspective, we are systematically led away from ourselves, from our conscience, from our internal voice, from our own joy and sense of health and well-being. And we can go a long time believing or doing things that are not only against our conscience or a sense of well-being, but that actually are harmful to us. And we become numb to the damage that we're ultimately inflicting upon ourselves.
Yeah, like if you asked me the statement of my deconversion, it would be something like coming home to myself, or coming back to me, or something like that for my deconversion process, what it's meant.
You kind of came home.
Yeah, coming home.
That's what it was like. That's what the process has been.
Mm-hmm.
That's the aha moment. I think that's the one true gift of the faith crisis, is you get to know yourself for the first time. I tell people in my workshops and retreats, what did Jesus say? The kingdom of God is what?
It's within you.
The kingdom of God is within you. That's where it's all in. And the extent to which we're externally oriented towards external authority, external morality, external spirituality, external guidelines, external social constructs, we can be doing that at the expense of our own conscience and our own internal self and self-awakening. Natasha, you want to add anything about that?
Well, I think I drive probably people crazy with my perspective on this, and this is personal. So I just, for me, like you said, Margie, coming home feels personal, like that's you. For me, it's like, I guess I refused to let them be the Mormon identity, as far as the church. So for me, it's like, I will say something like, I feel more Mormon than ever because of these social justice things, because I'm advocating for ways that I see our church hurting people. That doesn't make me less Mormon. I feel like that makes me more Mormon, because for me, the doctrine and the principles and the things that I've decided to take authority and actually believe, the Mormon doctrine of personal revelation, I feel like those things, by the fruit you shall know them. And right now there's a lot of rotting fruit at the base of, the church office building, I'm sorry to say, is my perspective. And so it's a little bit different language than what you're using, Margie, but I think it's a similar concept in that I reclaimed my own Mormonism. And maybe I don't fit the stereotype. Maybe I'm not active the way, the cultural kind of aspects of it, but I feel more Mormon than ever. And in my social advocacy work.
I love that, Natasha. It rings true. I gave a talk once at an oasis in Kansas City, and I called it How Mormonism Led Me Away from Mormonism. But it was my love of truth and my, the church teaching me to be courageous and to do what is right, let the consequence follow. And my love for and a desire to alleviate suffering that really led to my faith crisis in so many ways. And all that's very Mormon. So sometimes it's Mormonism that sets us up for deconversion from Mormonism, or at least from a less mature, less healthy, or more rigid form of Mormonism for many of us. Not to say that Orthodox Mormons are unhealthy or inferior, but for me, I'm in a healthier, happier place. And I know a lot of other people who feel that way. And if Orthodoxy is working for you, by all means, stay Orthodox, right? All right. Natasha, do you have a quote ready you want to read?
Yeah, so this is from Weston. He says, my deconversion began with my divorce. And the divorce gave me a new ability to reevaluate and critically question my beliefs, habits, and ethical foundation. I began to be open with friends and family about my feelings of disillusionment with the Orthodox Mormon lifestyle. I felt that I was promised one outcome if I followed the teachings of the church, but I was getting a very different outcome. So right there you have familial, social, and existential issues. And then he said, because of my openness, a family member asked me to read Jeremy Reynolds' letter, which is a CS letter. And I've been traveling down that rabbit hole for the past 2 years. So therein is the intellectual. So he's got all four as part of this comment. And as a result, I've been able to love with a greater capacity than ever before, now that I don't have to place so many conditions on my friendships and empathy.
Love it. All right, let's keep them coming. So Lisa, shout out to Lisa. She writes, my experience started when I came home from my mission and got a job with the church, the LDS church. Isn't it funny how we say the church as if there's only one? That's so Mormon. I don't know if other churches do that too, but they probably do, or some do. So Lisa says she got a job at the church and was fired with not one word of explanation or warning, and that got the ball rolling for her. She said she went to church for years just trying to find her way in life and her place on this so-called plan that they claimed God had for her. She wrote, I could no longer sit in a church where they taught marriage and children and eternal families and how to teach your children as a good mother, and I will never have those experiences in my life. I came to notice feelings of complete loneliness, the loss of self, and was always so sad, wondering why God's plan wasn't working for me. Wow, very vulnerable, raw. There she's mentioning some ecclesiastical abuse, because even though it's church employment, you still expect when you work for the church to have a higher standard of ethical treatment, and not everyone has that when they work with the church. And working for the church could definitely be fatal to people's testimonies, I've found. But she also just talks about, gender stereotypes and expectations on women and around motherhood and children that made her feel like the plan of salvation wasn't for her. And the church kind of sets us up for that too, because they call it the great plan of happiness, right? And so and they say men is, and it should be men and women are, that they might have what, Natasha?
Joy.
Right? And so what happens if it's not bringing us joy to be in the church? That's gonna erode our commitment and to the church. You shouldn't be feeling lonely in church. And there's that great quote from Robin Williams where he says, I used to think of loneliness as being alone, but there's nothing more lonely, and I'm massacring it, but he says there's nothing more lonely than feeling alone when you're with somebody. And I'm sure that is multiplied when you're in a church and you're expecting Christ's community to heal your needs. And in reality, you just feel more lonely. That's got to be really hard. So thank you, Lisa, for sharing. Margi, what do you got? And Natasha, you're next.
Yeah, so kind of more on the existential side of things around loss and meaning and, death. I experienced my dad's death a couple of years ago. And I do feel like oftentimes that loss or even thinking about death can be something that is really, really profound for people. Deanna wrote in and said, in my youth, I experienced a series of powerful, spiritually transformative experiences, which led me to Mormonism. Because of this, I followed the religion with exactness for the past 40 years. 5.5 years ago, my father passed away, and 1 year later, to the date of his death, I began experiencing deep inner questions regarding aspects of the church, namely polygamy and the origins of the temple endowment. And as I delved into researching these topics, I soon found my world crumbling around me. So oftentimes those existential experiences or longings or questions around meaning and loss can also, I think, create an emotional awareness or nest that provide a transitioning process.
And Natasha, will come to you in a sec. Deanna, when she brings up the temple endowment and even polygamy, it's really interesting in 2019, just as a moment in time in history. Since around 2013, 14, the church has started coming out with these gospel topics essays, where on the internet, because it was sort of backed into a corner, the church has been acknowledging for the first time many of its troubling historical problems. And Masonry is just one of those. We just had the church in the past few weeks not only change their temple ceremony in very fundamental ways away from, again, a lot of the Masonic rituals that that Joseph Smith incorporated when he first created the endowment after having been a Master Mason. But now we have the church acknowledging in an essay on LDS.org that in fact the church temple ceremony in many ways comes from the Masonic ceremony. And it's these sort of gospel topics essays around things like polygamy and blacks in the priesthood and feminism and Masonry and all these other things that oftentimes are becoming a companion to people's faith crisis as they're discovering more about their church. All right, Natasha, what do you got?
So I'm going to do part of Tamara's comment here because I think this is an important one. She says, she's the one who is married in a mixed orientation marriage, but then she also says, I then experienced a sexual assault and sexuality in general changed completely for me. It went from this loving, beautiful thing between a husband and wife, which I really did experience being married, but then it turned into something that was very different from what I had been taught. Teachings about sexuality started to feel wrong to me, especially after therapy. So I'm guessing she did some good trauma work with her therapist and now had different narratives or scripts around sexuality. Not exactly sure in our, and maybe John, you can help me out with this, but in our list of kind of, familial, social, I think sometimes we just have some very profound personal experiences, and maybe this falls under existential, where we're trying to make meaning, where we're trying to understand, what, especially things that are very horrific or trauma-centered. Margi just brought up death, for example, what these things are going to mean for our lives. And sometimes I think religious scripts help with that, and sometimes they come dramatically short for people. And I think that's a reason, I've had people lose their faith kind of after a sibling or child died of cancer, sexual assault, divorce. It's really traumatic events that, again, for some, religion kind of acts as a comforter during those times. And for some, it just feels incredibly minimizing of their pain or their situation.
Absolutely. Couple quick comments. Juliet writes, we were insta-resigners. It was easier as we have no relatives within 1,000 miles. That helped. So it sounds like Juliet and her husband learned about problems with the church and resigned almost immediately. And that's a very fast, I think she's responding to the velocity at which some people respond. I want to read Judy Judkins. Hey, Judy. She's challenging this idea. She's reflecting this idea that we talked about you, Natasha, when you said sometimes an awakening can make you feel like you're living truer to Mormonism than not. Judy writes, she's challenging you, Natasha. Is it Mormonism that has inspired you to advocate and search for truth? Or is it a human response to suffering and doubts? What do you think, Natasha? Judy's putting you on the hot spot there.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that there's something beautiful about just kind of humanity, right? And I think that's why a lot of people kind of start identifying as humanists or existentialists in some way, universalists, after maybe some of these faith transitions. And I would too. I definitely don't credit that, if I would have been born Catholic or Jewish or atheist, I think I would have had very similar awakenings in my life. I guess where I'm just trying to be a little snarky with my own relationship with Mormonism is that I'm like, hey, Mormon leaders up on the Mount, you don't get to define this for me. Like if I, this is the space where I grew up. This is the space where I came to, have some of these ideals or ideas. And there are some things that I still find very symbolically beautiful about certain aspects of Mormon doctrine. And if I want to claim those, and if I'm acting in ways that you taught me to act, I still get to call myself Mormon if I want to. So it's more of an empowerment thing, but by all means, I totally agree with Judy that I don't credit Mormonism only. I think we all come with kind of innate, beautiful aspects of humanity that hopefully eventually lead most of us anyway towards empathy instead of away from it.
Yeah. We watched a documentary on that. Do you remember? I think it's called I Am, where it basically breaks apart the brain and talks about how our brain is actually wired to want to feel for others, help others. Do you remember?
Yeah.
That?
Yeah. So thanks to Judy for bringing some humanity into the conversation. Read Noel's, or read your next one, Margie. I'm really interested in this one.
Yeah, so I love this one because it kind of encapsulates conversion and deconversion in kind of one comment. So Noelle writes, conversion happened for me during a critical time in my life. I had just stopped dancing professionally and had broken up with my boyfriend. I was sad and looking for something that would help me grow as a person. Enter my friend Kat, who is bright and a beautiful person. We became fast friends. I went to church with her and enjoyed the lessons and the positive aspects of Mormonism. I can honestly say Mormonism helped to shape me into the person I wanted to become. Most importantly, it helped me to become a more introspective person. All said, I didn't have all the information regarding the church and its history. Once I learned about the obfuscations, it changed everything. And as much as I had gained from being a member of the church, I couldn't in good conscience stay. It was devastating. It is ironic that some of the most valued principles I learned in Mormonism are the very same principles that caused me to question and leave it. Principles like integrity, honesty, and seeking after truth. Truth be told, I never set out to leave. I set out to understand. I just wasn't prepared for what I would find.
Wow. Yeah. Shout out to Noelle. Beautiful comment. And she's reflecting what so many in the 2010s are experiencing, which is this feeling of betrayal, having been lied to, of having been deceived, of having been fooled by the church. Not to say the church meant to do this or it was anyone's intent or that everyone experiences this, but many, many, many people do. And it's like this gut punch where you feel sick inside, where you feel like almost like discovering a parent isn't your real parent, but you lived your whole life under the misperception that the parent was your parent because that's what you were taught. And that's hitting a lot of people. And Noelle captured it really, really beautifully. And it is devastating. All right, Natasha, you got one more?
Yeah, I didn't see Noelle, so I'm not sure I'm totally up to date with all the comments. But
we're drawing some from the Google Doc. We pasted.
Oh, okay.
But it's okay.
There's PJ says, I really struggled with my faith after I lost my grandparents who helped raise me 7 years ago. The comfort that the gospel had given me in the past was not ringing true for me any longer. So that really speaks to some of what we were talking about, where things that used to be comforting or were comforting under a certain context for some is no longer. And then there has to be different types of meaning that comes that the religion can't offer.
I'll also add, in PJ's case, she brings up a really important point. A lot of times your parents or grandparents being alive becomes a really binding force to your continued religious adherence. Mm-hmm. But when your parents or spouse or whoever passes or leaves your life, all of a sudden something that could have been a main motivator. Like, I don't want to disappoint my mom. I don't want to disappoint my dad. I don't want to break their hearts or whatever it is. Sometimes the passing of a loved one can give you, for the first time in your life, the freedom to consider whether maintaining activity in the church or belief in the church works for you. Because again, who wants to break mom's heart when she's 80 years old or 90 years old and in a rest home, or when or when you'd be shut out of the will? Who wants to go through a faith crisis when you would be disappointing a loved one or putting yourself at risk? And so that can also be what the passing of a loved one can do.
Indeed.
Yeah. Linda writes one. Do you want to read Linda's, Natasha?
Let me see if I see that all of a sudden. Yes, I do. As an adopted child, I adapted by becoming a compliant child. I spent much of life trying to be worthy of my family and divinity, as well as to be more like them. Orthodoxy was about love and becoming. My family's tradition was Orthodox. My father was very involved, excuse me, in missionary work, having served as a stake missionary in 70 much of my youth. I was Orthodox and fully believing, but built a heavy shelf along the way. I believe I was prepared over time. I somehow managed to live with my struggle, doubting down with each challenge, but feeling increasingly out of step or unworthy. Sorry, as more comments come in, it changes where my spot is. A real turning point occurred after I had a difficult adoption reunion and its aftermath with my family. At that time, I also felt my daughter was becoming distant in ways I couldn't fully understand. We had always been close. I'm so grateful for the day when the timing was right for both of us to have a crucial understanding. During that discussion, she shared her own faith journey. The floodgate was open, and she shared more than she had wished. She led me to the essays, CES letter, Rough Stone Rolling, and Mormon stories. I believed her. I began to read the CES letter that day. A light switch turned on, and my faith shattered. While my faith shattered in a moment, I took time to study. For me, truth is best understood when the head and the heart agree. Now the great gift of my faith journey was a return to the whole self.
Well, I got chills down my spine. That was beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda, for sharing. Natasha, any responses to that?
Yeah, I think, I think that this idea of belonging is such an integral part of how we're wired, and desperately wanting to belong. And I think the whole first part of this is she talks about fitting into her family system, and that, that was a great impetus for shelving things. So as things came up, it threatened that sense of belonging. And so therein lies the shelf. And then, then a different type of belonging issue happened with her daughter, where now, there was some distance there that went the other way, and it allowed for those things that had been on that shelf to kind of come down. So that very much follows that model that we were talking about these emotional things that are happening all along the way. And some of them we may not even be fully really very self-aware about, but they kind of create this, like you're saying, fertile ground for change and seeing things in a different light.
Yeah.
And that's what ends up happening for many people in the deconversion process. It happens also in the conversion process, but happens deconversion as well. It's kind of the same, two sides of the same coin.
I love it. Really quickly, for those who are listening, if any of you would be willing to, this is just a quick favor, to like the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis, Facebook page, give us a positive review, share this with friends and family. Those of you who it's safe and you're comfortable doing so, that could go a long way to helping us spread the word about this podcast. Tamara writes, in the spirit of the consequences of a Facebook comment, and I'm going to disincent some of you probably to do what I just asked you to do. Tamara writes, I was recently told by a family member in a private message on Facebook, after I commented on a Mormon Stories podcast, that my mother would be upset by my lack of faith, that I should think of my parents. So Tamara's giving us an example of how family guilt or fear can be used to bind us to orthodoxy or to commitment, or at least to the appearance of orthodoxy. And then our dear friend Jennifer from Colorado, who attended one of our mixed faith retreats last year, shout out to Jennifer. She writes, the first crack was when our stake president came to our house and asked for a significant donation to Proposition 8. Our oldest son lost it in front of the stake president. He was out of the church in an instant. It has been a slow burn for the rest of our family. So yeah, sometimes the church taking political action when it might otherwise be well suited to stay out of the political arena can sometimes really be an impetus for people. So thank you, Jennifer, for sharing. Shout out to you and the family. Okay, I want to shift and end this episode by talking about one really reason why this matters. And why did we pick this topic? Some may feel like it's stating the obvious. Hopefully many of you have felt empathized with. Hopefully many of you feel good that we've been able to share some of your narratives. Hopefully those of you who are trying to understand people in a faith crisis have been able to get a better sense. I want to refer those of you who haven't listened to earlier episodes to our episodes around stereotypes. We just want to acknowledge all the dumb stereotypes that exist about why people lose their faith in the church, because they're lazy, because they wanted to sin, because they never believed in the first place, because they wanted a beer, because they were angry, because they
want to have sex.
What's that?
They want to have sex.
Yeah. There are all sorts of ways that Orthodox Mormons devalue and discredit and try and stereotype the deconversion process. And almost none of them are true. Nobody who ever really believed in this church leaves over superficial reasons or because they were offended, right? They leave for very deep and meaningful reasons. And I think we've done a good justice to trying to represent some of that. Josh writes, beer is good, but I had no idea until well over a year after leaving. So I haven't tried beer. Have you tried beer, Margie?
I have not tried beer, John.
Natasha, I'm not going to ask you if you've tried beer.
I have tried beer many times. I am an avid beer drinker. I love beer. I continue to drink it.
Wait, how can you attend church and drink beer? How does that work?
Oh, I don't know. I'm claiming Mormonism on my own terms. I'm more Mormon than ever.
For reframing earlier?
For those who don't know, the word of wisdom actually supports the drinking of beer. Read it. It talks about mild drinks of barley. And if you understand what that meant when Joseph Smith wrote it, he was a beer drinker and he supported drinking beer. And for him, beer drinking was not in violation of the Sabbath. That's not an endorsement of beer. It's just a historical fact.
Wow. I mean, we're learning all sorts of
I'm telling you, I am super Mormon.
You are.
So am I. I'm the most Mormon post-Mormon on the planet. I'm taking credit for that.
And
Margie.
People are noticing that you guys are tan. You're tanner than I am. So
hey, we did get some sun in Mexico.
Yes, you did.
Okay, so stereotypes aside, the reason why I really wanted to talk about this today is because it addresses an understanding of the emotional basis of a religious faith crisis is super important for helping progressive and post-Mormons learn to communicate better with their believing family and friends. And here's what I mean. The huge mistake that we all make when we have this shift, when we have this loss of faith, when our world falls apart, we immediately, a couple things happen. We either want to, rescue and save all these other people from a church that we now think could be harmful to them, or we want to win people over or avoid the loss of status in their eyes from having no longer being Orthodox believing members. And so in that desire to rescue our reputations or save others, we immediately make this huge mistake as post-Mormons of trying to use logic to deconvert people or to at least awaken people to the problems. And we see it all the time. These post-Mormons are like, I lost my faith and I had all these people around me. So I wrote this big exit letter and I told them all the problems with the church. I told them about polygamy and Book of Abraham and peepstones and the hat and folk magic and anachronisms and the horses and the steel. and the masonry and the temple ceremony, all with this, just naive belief that if they just knew the truth, they would see the church as I do and leave. And we've talked about the backfire effect a million times now on Mormon Stories and on this podcast. Not only do we, fail to deconvert them from the church, we often actually, as the backfire effect teaches, reinforce and strengthen their commitment to the church, because that's what happens. The backfire effect teaches us when you introduce evidence, irrefutable evidence, to someone who has a closely held belief that's tied and meshed with their identity, we actually inadvertently strengthen their beliefs and their commitment instead of weaken it. And this is, in my view, a result of a fundamental misunderstanding of deconversion. You cannot deconvert someone intellectually from a position that they arrived at emotionally. And so if these people are not emotionally moved, as we all just got through saying what was our emotional impetus for disaffection, if the people that we're working with or talking to or sharing with have not had the emotional shift, trying to forcibly shift them to a non-believing state through the introduction of logic and evidence, not only is going to be ineffective, not only is it going to backfire, but it's also going to damage your relationship. So do not try this at home. Immediately stop any attempt to deconvert anyone intellectually. It won't work. And I would even argue that trying to deconvert them emotionally isn't going to work, because people have to go through their own process and it can't be forced upon them. And so if I could give one piece of advice to the progressive and post-Mormon, it's that they never try and deconvert anyone, ever. That they focus on finding as much joy and healing as they can and making those around them who are believers feel safe and unthreatened. Because until they feel safe and unthreatened, they will have their guard up and they'll be protecting themselves from any shift that they might possibly have intellectually or emotionally in terms of their religious orthodoxy. And that was a little bit of a soapbox.
Well, I love that Josh says, guilty of trying to save others with the logic. And I often
Josh
call this
up to it.
Yeah, I often call this our missionary DNA, and I don't care where you're at on the Mormon spectrum, you still probably have it. So we've been raised in a culture where, being a missionary is kind of ingrained in us. So watch that, I guess leaning, right, that we all have within us to want to do that.
And realize that maybe one of the biggest influencers that, we have, not necessarily having it be our intention to influence or to bring people around but is simple embodiment. It's actually living, our values and living our life over time. That actually, I feel like, is one of the most influential things that we can do.
Well, and just like we critique people who are Orthodox for being judgmental of us, again, it's very easy for us to be judgmental of more Orthodox people. And I think, when you get into the higher levels, like the stages of faith, 5 and 6, it's more about, can you really be accepting and loving of people where they're at? And that's really living our religion and our values in ways that most of us struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
We got a comment from one of my favorite Mormon Stories episode interviewees of all time, Jared Spotted Elk. I interviewed Jared on Mormon Stories podcast as a part of my Losing the Lamanites series. Jared's a Native American, and he was raised a Native American Mormon, and he's super wise and interesting. And I'm glad Jared wrote this question, but this is a really important question. And I want to kind of end our episode today with this question, because it's driving the question a little bit deeper than what we just talked about. Jared writes, and I'm going to add a little bit of color. He says, okay, if we shouldn't try intellectually to deconvert somebody, Jared asks, would there be any good suggestion to introduce a possible spiritual shift to another? So he's basically saying, all right, if we can't intellectually deconvert somebody, is there a way to nurture emotional or spiritual discovery or growth that then could trigger a deconversion, or at least a deconversion from orthodoxy? And you get this from so many mixed faith couples. It's just like, okay, yes, we can figure out how to have a mixed faith marriage. And by the way, I'd like to argue that a mixed faith marriage is an incredibly positive opportunity for all sorts of fertile growth and development in the family. But you do get these non-believing spouses in a mixed faith marriage, or a sibling who has no siblings that are non-believers, or whoever, who just like, if I could just jumpstart a faith crisis somehow, our marriage would be so much better. I could get my brother or sister again. I could reconnect with my parents. And there's this real sincere desire to try and move people along the spectrum and even jumpstart a deconversion. What do you guys think about that? Is that unethical? Is it ethical? Is it prudent? Is it mean? Jared Spotted Elk is asking us.
I feel like I don't know, but I have a few just things that come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is, I feel like as human beings, we sniff out judgment or an intention from another person really, really quickly. So if in any way, that suggestion of a shift right there, if there's this sense of like, could you be more enlightened, or maybe you're a little bit limited, that gets sniffed out pretty quickly. That's just my experience. And so kind of being aware of that. I find the second thing I find is just, what level relationship is this? One thing Brene Brown said recently I loved was, her talk on vulnerability, that many people have taken that talk and they're now being vulnerable with everyone. It's like licensed to be vulnerable. And the point was just, that people we share our vulnerability with, should be worthy of that vulnerability. And so one thing just to kind of maybe contemplate is just, what level relationship is this? Is this a really deep and vulnerable relationship? And then if so, that would be a different thing than if it's like, you talk deeply about some things, but not other things. And that's something that I use, kind of a level 1 to level 5 being really, really deep. 1 being like, you talk about the weather and how good food is and kind of how their job is. That can be helpful. And then the last thing I would just say is the most effective thing that I've found, and I'm curious for Natasha and John, is just asking questions, is honestly being open-hearted with this idea of, I want to understand you better. And I want to know I'm curious what love looks like to you and how it plays out in your life, or whatever the conversation or that you're thinking with regard to a spiritual shift, that questions, really objective, loving questions that are laid out there to explore and to get to know another human being, I feel like is one of the most powerful tools with regard to creating an environment where a shift is more apt to happen. But then again, that person would also need to be ready for a shift. So those are just some things that came to mind for me.
Natasha, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I want to give a shout out to something called street epistemology. As Margi talks about just asking questions, street epistemology is a process by which, and you can go to streetepistemology.com to learn about it, or you can Google street epistemology Mormon, because there are some YouTube examples of people using street epistemology with Mormons. But it's basically just this process of asking people what they believe, how they believe what they believe, and why they believe what they believe. I know Jeremy Runnels is a big fan of this, but some people have found it as an effective way to help people dig a little bit deeper. And Natasha, I'm going to ask you this question again, because there are you hear a lot of people who, once they discover the church isn't what they thought it was, say, I wish I had known sooner, right? I wish someone had told me this sooner. Maybe I would have made a bunch of different decisions. So it's reasonable for a non-believer to want to, quote, wake up or enlighten somebody else. And, we can dismiss it as just simply the Mormon missionary zeal in reverse. But isn't there something credible to a desire, once you've discovered truth, once you've discovered the potential harm of Mormonism, isn't there something potentially reasonable or even laudable about wanting to awaken others, to either prevent them from future harm or to give people a chance to see the church for what it is and to take control of their lives, or to discover who they are? But they won't get that until they wake up from the sleep of what many would say is religious fundamentalism, the deep sleep. What do you say to that, Natasha?
One of the things that I really liked about presenting with you, one of the first times we did, was the imagery that you had of Lehi and the fruit, and he picks this fruit, and then what's the first thing he wants to do with it is he wants to share it with the people he loves. And I think that's true no matter where we're at, whatever our truth is, whatever we have found to be helpful or new information, we want to share it with the people whom we most love. And if your truth is fundamentally different from my truth, that's where it can become very painful and confusing and difficult, and people feel attacked, or if people feel, offended with one another, even though I think the desire is very loving and well-meaning and well-intentioned to share what I have found out, especially if you're my spouse, right, or my child, or my dear deep friend. So it is complicated. I think sometimes you just have to test the waters. You can share a few things and see how it goes. And again, to Margi's point, depending on the level of intimacy you have with somebody, but you also have to be prepared that people are going to have a very different experience with information than you've had. And so then at that point, you can kind of back up and focus more on love and respect and relationship rather than information. I think there's room for both. And, I think too that, I just lost my train of thought. That's it.
No, think about it. I'll just fill in and then we can come back to you. Natalie writes, I hope speaking out on this is valid because I can't keep my mouth shut lately. And that's so typical, Natalie.
Natural, yeah.
We've all been through it. None of us are going to do this perfectly. And it is really impossible to stay quiet. So we need to bring a healthy dose of acceptance to this faith crisis, realizing that we're going to have a hard time keeping it quiet, even if keeping quiet is the right thing to do. It's going to be super hard, and sometimes we're going to totally blow it, if not blow it a lot for a long period of time. I still, you do have people who feel, motivated or impressed that they should tell a sibling or a spouse or a parent or a friend. And you do hear instances where that spouse or that sibling or that parent or that friend is eternally grateful for what they learned, and their lives are forever changed in the positive. And so that is a possible outcome. And we don't want to short circuit that from ever happening. It's also possible to destroy relationships irreparably. There are, family members who I don't have a relationship anymore because of the decisions that I've chosen. Now, overall, I'm sad about those lost relationships, but overall, I feel like the importance of what I've done, chosen to speak out so publicly, has been worth it, even though I'll always mourn the loss of those relationships. But everyone needs to realize that speaking out carries potential benefits, but it carries potential real risks. It can hurt your marriage. It can hurt your family relationships. It can hurt friendships. It can It can even affect inheritance or employment. And I don't say all those things to instill fear. I think ultimately authenticity and vulnerability is the key to growth and healthy living. So I tend to err on the side of vulnerability and openness and honesty, but I don't want to irresponsibly advocate for that, because there can be real material downsides or risks to speaking out, and it can harm other people. There are people, and this, I don't want this to come across as condescending, but there are people that want or need religion and whose lives are better off with it. And who wants to be responsible for stripping someone of their religion without providing them any superior replacement, only to see their lives fall apart? And that can happen. People can flourish and take off, or they can fall to the ground with a thud and have all sorts of very negative collateral damage happen, either to a marriage or to their own personal health or their lifestyle choices. And so I never want to be in the position personally where I think I know someone better than they do, where I think I'm going to push on them my agenda. Maybe that comes from my training as a psychologist. I just don't believe it's ethical to push your morals or agenda or values on people. I think people's journey and process should be respected. And so that's why Jared Spotted Elk, I tend to lean against being that zealot that tries to convert people, or even try and push them down a new spiritual or emotional track, because I would never want to harm them. And by the way, Jared tells me that I've confused him with his brother. So it wasn't Jared who was on Mormon Stories, but it was his awesome brother. But Jared says he's every bit as smart and as thoughtful and as intelligent and as insightful as his brother. So Jared, we'll have to have you on Mormon Stories soon.
I would just like to say that I think that we're delving into future topics that we're going to be really talking about, communicating with family and friends, and when and if you want to share what are some good strategies in regards to all that. So please stay tuned for future episodes, because we'll definitely be talking about those things. I think going back to your original point, John, is that we're wanting people to understand that both conversion to and deconversion from are very normal human experiences. Both have a lot of similar processes involved with those. And then, back to even the question about can we have some influence? I'm a big believer that the biggest way we influence is shifting within ourselves. So how we show up, how we have conversations with people. As a marriage therapist, it's very classic that people come into therapy and, what are they doing? They're telling me, well, he's the problem, she's the problem. They're not usually saying, oh, I'm the problem. Every now and then I get those. But typically we're trying to change the mind of the other person. And the number one kind of rule of doing effective marriage therapy is to get people to really focus more on their own role, what they have control over. You only have control over yourself, very little control over another person. So I think that we automatically, in many ways, potentially shift for spiritual change just in our interactions with other people, especially if we show up in ways that are loving and respectful.
I so agree. All about embodiment.
Yep. So I think, Jared, the best thing any of us can do is live the best, happiest, healthiest life that we can. And if we've found joy and truth and health and well-being, how can that not be obvious and visible to the people around us? Maybe that's the best testimony of all. And having said that, I don't want progressive and post-Mormons to feel the pressure of having to be perfect and shining examples of perfection, because we hated that in Mormonism.
True.
We don't need that in progressive or post-Mormonism either. But I still love your idea, Natasha, of just living the best truth you can and living the best life you can is the best witness.
And loving well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is time to wrap up this episode. We want to thank all our many listeners for joining us. We have a few things to share before we end. Want to remind people about the upcoming Mormon Faith Crisis events. I'm going to just go through them quickly. We've got Orem, Utah in February, Las Vegas in February, Ogden in March, a mixed faith retreat in Salt Lake City in April for mixed faith couples. We've got Gilbert, Arizona in May, Park City retreat in June, Switzerland in Europe in late June, Colorado in August, Southern California in September, an open retreat in October, place to be determined if you want your own retreat or workshop. And then we're going to try and do a mixed faith retreat again in November. Please check out mormonfaithcrisis.com/events to register for these events. To learn more, again, February 13th in a couple days, I'll be doing a free workshop, 7 p.m. at Community of Christ. Natasha, we're going to get some events coming to the Midwest, right?
Well, I was going to ask for a shout out, I guess. So I am more than happy. I mean, I live in Wichita, Kansas, so I'm more than happy to drive to Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Omaha. I can get a very cheap flight into Chicago, Milwaukee, Dallas. If you're in any of those types of areas and have a home that could potentially host 20 to 30 people, to have a, either one day or weekend or even an evening type of workshop to help with mixed faith marriages, faith transitions, sexuality, a variety of things that I can present on. I'd be super happy to be able to do that. And the best way we can do that is to lower costs. So if somebody can provide the venue, and if it's somewhere that I can get to fairly cheaply, then we can lower the cost and hopefully have more people attend. So if you're in any of those types of cities and think that you would be a great host as far as your home, please reach out to us. Let us know that you'd be willing to do that, and we can make that happen, because I'd love to meet a lot of you in those areas.
And you could reach out, you can request a workshop or retreat at mormonfaithcrisis@gmail.com. That's where you email us. Christine notes that the events aren't there right now. That's true. I finalized these events in the hour preceding this podcast episode. So I will be getting the registration information for all these events up in the next day or two. So please return to mormonfaithcrisis.com/events, and you'll see registration information and details for all these events. Really quickly, if you want to support us, there's several ways to do it. You can become a donor, a monthly donor. Go to mormonfaithcrisis.com, click on the donate button. Again, 10, 25, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford, will pay for the expenses for this podcast, but it'll also be paying forward. Whatever benefit you get from it will not only benefit you, but also it will benefit generations to come with this support for the Faith Crisis. So if you guys will keep supporting, we'll keep doing this. Big thanks to our 20 donors that are donating, or 25 donors that are donating so far. You're making this possible. We really appreciate it. Please like our Facebook page. Please give a positive review on our Facebook page. Positive review on iTunes makes a big difference. Please share this with other people. Email us. And of course, if any of you need coaching, you can reach Natasha at natashaparker.org, Margi at beautyinthenow.org, and me at johndolin.com. We love to support people in their individual needs when we can. So thanks so much to everyone. Tamara writes, I've donated and then had my work match it. So Tamara's encouraging everyone to use their work to match the donations. We appreciate that. Actually, that may not work, because right now the Mormon Faith Crisis is not a 501c3 thing. So we don't know if your work will match that, but maybe they will. If they will, do it. If not, support the Open Stories Foundation and Mormon Stories Podcast and Mormon Mental Health Podcast, because those that is a 501c3 nonprofit. And so anyway, thanks to everyone. We're going to have a lot more episodes. We're going to do this every week. So every Tuesday, we'll do this live stream, and we'll be covering much more topics in the weeks and months ahead. If you have a request for a topic, email us at mormonfaithcrisis@gmail.com. If you want to share a story or make a recommendation, we'd love to hear it. And again, please tell everyone about this podcast, everyone you know, so that we can help as many people as possible. Jared wants to know if I can coach him on his jump shot. Absolutely, Jared. Meet me in Holiday, Utah, and we'll do some basketball coaching. All right, everyone. We love you. Margi, you're awesome. Thank you.
You're awesome. Natasha, you're awesome.
Natasha, you're wonderful.
You are both amazing. I love my Tuesdays with the Dolins. So, and everybody else who joins us.
Yes,
thank you for
joining us.
everybody who comments and makes it just so much more interactive and valuable, I think, when we have so many people who make, who share their stories and tell us about their experiences. So thank you to everybody.
Absolutely. Shout out to Jana and Brian and Melissa and Maddie and everyone who's joining us. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you guys soon on another edition of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. Appreciate everyone. Take care, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.